So if you break your arm, an X-ray gives you this really clean, jagged white line on a black background.
Right, it is entirely binary.
Exactly. Broken or not broken, and is a very satisfying, visible categorization. But, when you step into the world of clinical neuroscience, and specifically when you look at the human brain, that X-ray machine is utterly useless for telling you how the tissue actually functions.
Yes, structurally it might look fine, but functionally it is a completely different story.
Right. And for centuries, the diagnostic landscape of the brain was incredibly murky. We basically mapped the human brain almost entirely through loss. I mean, neurologists like C. Miller Fisher noted that we learned about brain function stroke by stroke.
Stroke by stroke, that is a great way to frame it.
Yeah, because a patient loses blood flow to a specific temporal lobe region, and then they permanently lose the ability to comprehend language. So neurologists deduce that, well, this specific area must govern language.
We learn the architecture of the mind through subtraction, basically, through silence.
Exactly, through silence. But if you're joining us for this exclusive deep dive in the Enkephalikos series, you are here to explore diseases of the nervous system at a much more profound level. And the phenomenon we are exploring today offers the exact opposite paradigm to that classical lesion method.
We are looking at seizures.
Right, seizures, which show us how the brain works not through a dead zone of tissue, but through sudden, explosive neural hyperactivity. I mean, seizures quite literally hijack the normal functions of the brain, and in doing so, they map out the brain's hidden wiring for us to see while it's running in absolute overdrive.
Yeah, it forces us to observe the architecture of the brain lighting up, often in this highly sequenced, incredibly anatomical pattern.
Like watching the circuits work just excessively.
Right, excessively and abnormally. The seizure acts almost like a tracer dye injected into the nervous system.
Oh, I like that. A tracer dye.
Because as the abnormal electrical activity spreads anatomically across the contiguous tissue of the brain, the corresponding bodily functions or, internal perceptions are forced to manifest.
It just lights up the map. But to truly grasp the clinical and biological reality of this, we really need to begin by untangling our baseline definitions, because popular culture conflates these terms endlessly.
Oh, constantly. But there is a rigid, fundamental biological difference between a seizure and epilepsy.
The distinction is vital because one is a singular event and the other is a lifelong condition, right?
Exactly. A seizure is a temporary event. It is a transient disruption of normal brain function that results from abnormal, excessive, and highly synchronized neuronal activity.
It is the electrical storm itself.
Yes, the storm. Epilepsy, conversely, is the chronic condition. It is the overarching neurological disorder characterized by an enduring pathological predisposition to generate those recurrent seizures.
So having one seizure doesn't mean you have epilepsy.
The foundational clinical rule is that a single seizure does not equate to epilepsy. I mean, you can experience a seizure from severe alcohol withdrawal or from profound sleep deprivation.
Or metabolic things, right, like plunging blood sugar.
Right, or in young children. From a massive sudden spike in a fever. Those are what we call provoked seizures.
Because once the provoking factor, like the fever or the withdrawal, is resolved, the brain just returns to its stable state.
Exactly. Epilepsy implies an underlying chronic network instability. It means the brain's own internal architecture is fundamentally predisposed to erupt into these electrical storms without any external provocation.
So the seizure is the symptom, the temporary hijacking, and epilepsy is the chronic disease of the network.
You got it.
And because a seizure is such a dramatic, visible, and frankly terrifying hijacking of the human body, historical interpretations of what was actually happening to a patient were, well, completely untethered from biology.
Completely. For centuries, the chronic condition of epilepsy was widely associated with possession by evil spirits or demonic forces.
I mean, the sheer violence of a grand malconvulsion really looked like an external entity had taken control.
It did. Yet, on the flip side, the temporary state of a seizure, particularly those that induced strange hallucinations or trances, was sometimes thought to be a sign of oracular power.
Oh, right, like a conduit for special creative genius.
Exactly. The prevailing societal view was that if you had a seizure, you were either cursed by demons or speaking directly to the gods.
Which is wild. But the visible manifestations of a generalized convulsion are so overwhelming that it is entirely understandable why ancient cultures resorted to supernatural explanations.
It really is. But the medical pivot point, the first moment of true clinical deduction, actually occurred much earlier than most people realize.
Right. How early are we talking?
If we trace the medical history back to ancient Greece, around the time of Hippocrates, roughly 400 BC, we find physicians making an anatomical connection that was centuries, if not millennia, ahead of its time.
In 400 BC, what did they notice?
They observed in combat and in accidents that traumatic head injuries to one side of the skull could cause seizure activity on the opposite side of the body.
The contralateral connection. That is unbelievable. They didn't have magnetic resonance imaging. They couldn't see the microscopic decussation of nerve fibers crossing over in the brainstem, but they observed pure, unadulterated cause and effect.
Yes. A soldier takes a rock to the left side of the head, and days later, his right arm begins violently shaking in a localized seizure.
So it was the first structural hint that seizures were deeply tied to the physical, biological wiring of the brain, completely independent of the whims of spirits.
Exactly. Hippocrates even famously wrote a treatise called On the Sacred Disease, where he explicitly argued that epilepsy was not divine in origin, but a disease of the brain, just like any other physical ailment.
But that purely biological understanding stalled for a long time, didn't it?
It stalled for a very long time. The true neurobiological analysis of epilepsy, the foundation of modern clinical neuroscience and how we map the cortex today, did not truly solidify until the work of John Hewlings Jackson in London during the 1860s.
The 1860s. So what did Jackson figure out?
He made a clinical observation that entirely shattered the existing paradigm of what a seizure was. He realized that seizures did not always have to involve a total loss of consciousness and massive full-body convulsions.
Oh, so he recognized the localized ones.
Right. He recognized that they could be associated with highly localized specific symptoms, just the rhythmic, uncontrollable jerking of a single thumb, for instance.
Just the thumb?
Yes. This was the formal recognition of what clinical neurology now classifies as focal or partial seizures.
And he took that localized observation and extrapolated it into one of the most famous clinical concepts in neuroanatomy, right? The Jacksonian march.
It remained one of the most elegant clinical deductions in the history of medicine.
How did he figure it out?
Jackson sat at the bedside of awake, conscious patients and watched seizures that began with a very specific, localized neurological symptom. He would observe a twitch starting in patient's thumb. Then, over the course of several seconds or minutes, the twitching progressed to involve the rest of the fingers, then moved up the hand, into the forearm, up to the shoulder, and eventually involved the muscles of the face on that same side.
Wow. So the seizure was physically marching across the patient's body in an orderly, highly predictable anatomical sequence.
Exactly. And from this purely visual observation, working decades before anyone had ever placed an electrode into a human brain, Jackson deduced that there must be an anatomical map.
He reasoned there was a specific, contiguous wiring diagram representing the entire organization of the human body, laid out spatially across the surface of the cerebral cortex.
He basically conceptualized the motor homunculus, the brain's internal map of the body, just by watching an electrical storm travel across it.
That is wild. The abnormal electrical discharge was acting as a highlighter, lighting up the thumb region of the cortex, spilling over into the adjacent arm region, and then spilling into the face region.
Right, because the abnormal electrical activity spreads anatomically across the contiguous tissue of the primary motor cortex. As the wave of depolarization hits a new cluster of neurons, the corresponding body part they control begins to convulse.
The physical body simply mirrored what the electricity was doing on the surface of the brain.
Jackson saw the map of the brain because the seizure painstakingly traced the geography of the cortex for him.
That is an incredible deduction. But, it brings up a glaring historical paradox that I want to push back on for a second.
Sure.
If Hippocrates was observing traumatic brain injuries and contralateral seizures in 400 BC, and John Hewlings Jackson didn't formalize the concept of a focal, localized seizure until the 1860s, that is a 2,000-year diagnostic black hole.
It is a massive gap, yeah.
When you read historical texts from the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, they almost exclusively describe massive, full-body, generalized seizures, the classic falling sickness. So does that mean these subtle focal seizures, just a twitching thumb or a sudden strange smell, are a modern invention? Were human brains just not having focal seizures in antiquity?
No, human neurobiology hasn't changed. It is not that focal seizures did not exist. It is that they were entirely missed, dismissed, or misdiagnosed by physicians of the time.
Ah, okay. Because they were looking for the big convulsions.
Exactly. Historical writers and physicians were captivated by the dramatic, generalized convulsive seizures because they're visually impossible to ignore. I mean, a grand mal seizure commands the attention of an entire room.
You can't really miss it.
But consider a seizure that involves a very limited non-motor area of the brain. It might just look like a patient having a brief moment of confusion or a temporary inability to find their words.
Or a sudden sensory hallucination of a foul odor, or a brief fainting spell.
Right. And without the conceptual framework that a seizure could be highly localized, and without modern electrophysiological tools to measure brainwaves, those subtle focal seizures were routinely written off as psychiatric hysteria, cardiovascular fainting, or spiritual visions.
Wow. Even today, distinguishing between a brief, focal-aware seizure and a psychological panic attack or a cardiac arrhythmia requires immense clinical skill and detailed patient history.
It really does. It's the ultimate diagnostic truth. You only see what you are trained to look for.
So once Jackson proved to the medical community that a seizure could just be a twitching thumb or a sudden spell of aphasia, the diagnostic net got infinitely wider and much more precise.
And from Jackson's theoretical mapping in the 1860s, the milestones in actively treating and mapping this disease accelerated at a blistering pace.
Yeah, the transition from passive observation to active surgical intervention was swift. I mean, in 1886, the British neurosurgeon Victor Horsley performed the first successful surgical treatment for epilepsy.
Relying heavily on Jackson's theories of localization, actually.
Right. Horsley resected a specific piece of cerebral cortex near a depressed skull fracture to cure a patient of their focal motor seizures. He used the clinical symptoms to find the physical lesion.
Then, the field of neuropharmacology began to emerge. In 1912, Alfred Hauptmann introduced phenobarbital, the first effective synthetic anticonvulsant.
And in 1937, Houston Merritt and Tracy Putnam discovered phenytoin, widely known as Dilantin, revolutionizing the chemical management of the disease.
And parallel to these pharmacological advances, we saw the birth of direct functional mapping. In 1929, the German psychiatrist Hans Berger developed electroencephalography, the EEG, giving us our first crude window into the electrical rhythms of the living human mind.
Which eventually led to the Montreal Neurological Institute in the 1950s, right? Neurosurgeons like Wilder Penfield and Herbert Jasper were routinely exposing the cortex of awake, locally anesthetized patients.
Yes, they used tiny electrical probes to stimulate the brain surface, directly mapping the exact motor and sensory homunculus that Jackson had theorized, pinpointing the precise boundaries of the epileptic focus before surgically removing it.
They literally use tiny electrical shocks to artificially induce the same symptoms the patient experienced during a seizure, finishing the map that Jackson started drawing in his head a century earlier.
Exactly.
But establishing this history isn't just about praising ancient physicians. We must remember why this relentless pursuit of diagnostic, biological, and surgical precision matters so much today.
It matters immensely to the patients.
It really does, because a diagnosis of epilepsy still carries an immense, often invisible psychosocial weight for a patient. It strips away driving privileges, it limits specific educational and employment opportunities, and it fundamentally alters a person's sense of bodily autonomy.
And while some limitations are absolutely necessary for public safety, much of the historical stigma, a lingering subconscious idea that a seizure reflects a fundamental flaw in the person's character or mind, lingers inappropriately.
Understanding the pure biology, knowing that this is fundamentally an issue of network synchronization and ion channel biophysics, helps strip away that ancient, heavy stigma.
It is a mechanical malfunction of a highly complex, wet electrical circuit. Nothing more, nothing less.
Which brings us directly into the modern clinical reality. If we understand that seizures map the brain and that a seizure can be highly localized or entirely widespread, we have to look at how modern medicine actually classifies these disruptions.
Because not all electrical storms involve the same circuits, and diagnosing the specific type of storm is the only way a neurologist can prescribe the correct biological intervention.
Let's start with the sheer scale of the condition, because the numbers are staggering. Epidemiological studies in the United States demonstrate that between 1% and 3% of all individuals who live to the age of 80 will be diagnosed with epilepsy at some point in their lives.
1 to 3% of the entire population is a huge number.
And the literature shows it follows a distinct bimodal distribution.
Right, the incidence peaks at the two extremes of life. The highest rates of new diagnoses are in the very young and the elderly.
Why the very young?
Well, in infants and young children, The brain is still intensely developing. The neural networks are forming, and the inhibitory interneurons, the brakes of the brain, are not always fully mature, making the system highly prone to hyperexcitability and synchronization.
Ah, so the brakes just aren't fully installed yet. And why does it spike again in the elderly population?
Because the aging brain accumulates physical insults. Decades of microvascular disease, major strokes, brain tumors, or neurodegenerative conditions leave physical scars on the cortex.
And those tiny areas of scarred gliotic tissue become highly irritable.
Exactly. They serve as the perfect spark plugs, the epileptic foci for new seizures to ignite.
And when those millions of people experience a seizure, neurologists broadly divide the clinical symptoms they experience into two overarching categories: positive signs and negative signs.
This is brilliant framework for understanding any brain pathology, actually.
Positive signs occur when the hyperactive electrical storm forces the brain to do something it was not actively planning or wanting to do.
Right. It is an active manifestation of excessive neural firing. So, if the seizure focus is in the primary visual cortex at the back of the brain, the positive sign might be the patient perceiving flashing geometric lights or bright colors that do not actually exist in the room.
Or if the focus is in the primary motor cortex, the positive sign is the uncontrollable rhythmic jerking of an extremity. The neural hyperactivity forces an unprompted output.
But the negative signs are equally crucial and often much harder to diagnose.
These reflect an impairment, right? A suppression or a complete shutdown of normal brain function during the electrical storm.
Yes. While a seizure is characterized by excessive activity, that chaotic electrical noise can completely jam the normal processing capabilities of a cortical region.
So a negative sign could manifest as a transient blindness if the visual cortex is overwhelmed.
Exactly. Or a sudden speech arrest where the patient perfectly understands what is being said, but absolutely cannot formulate a word.
Or a sudden localized paralysis, or, most profoundly and dangerously, a complete loss of cognitive awareness and consciousness.
The specific, unique combination of these positive and negative signs entirely dictates the patient's clinical presentation, and it is entirely dependent on the specific anatomical location and the widespread extent of the brain regions being hijacked by the discharge.
Which brings us to the grand division in clinical neurology, the primary binary classification scheme that dictates all diagnostic and treatment pathways. Focal onset seizures versus generalized onset seizures.
Let's thoroughly examine focal onset seizures first, which in older medical literature were referred to as partial seizures.
Okay, so a focal onset seizure, by its very definition, originates in a small, anatomically localized group of neurons.
This hyper-irritable cluster of cells is called the seizure focus. And because the electrical storm begins in one specific restricted area, the initial symptoms the patient experiences are dictated entirely by the normal physiological function of that specific brain region.
So as we noted earlier, if the focus is in the motor cortex controlling the hand, your hand forcefully jerks.
Or if it is in the somatosensory cortex, you might feel a sudden, intense burning or tingling sensation on one side of your body.
Okay. And we must further subdivide focal seizures based on whether the patient's consciousness and awareness are affected by the spreading electricity.
That is a critical distinction. If the seizure remains tightly confined to a small region of the cortex, and the patient is fully awake, fully aware of their surroundings, and fully aware that they are experiencing a symptom they cannot control, it is classified as a focal aware seizure.
Which used to be known as a simple partial seizure.
Right. However, if the electrical activity spreads just enough to involve bilateral structures or deep limbic networks, it can impair the patient's consciousness or awareness.
So the patient might not fall down, they might not convulse, they might just stare blankly and pick at their clothes, but they are completely unresponsive to their environment.
Exactly. And this is classified as a focal seizure with impaired awareness, formerly known as a complex partial seizure.
And this localized, creeping start to a focal seizure gives rise to one of the most culturally fascinating and clinically important phenomena in neurology, the aura.
The aura, yes.
A focal onset seizure is very often preceded by these telltale subjective symptoms. An aura is basically the absolute earliest manifestation of the seizure, isn't it?
It is. It is the sensory or cognitive product of the electrical activity just beginning to bubble up and synchronize in the seizure focus before it spreads widely enough to cause a larger observable clinical event.
And because the seizure focus can technically be anywhere in the cortex, auras can be incredibly specific, wildly varied and deeply bizarre.
Very bizarre. A patient might experience a sudden, unprovoked sense of sheer existential terror, suggesting the focus is near the amygdala.
Or they might feel a strange rising sensation in the pit of their stomach, often called an epigastric rising sensation, which is very common in temporal lobe epilepsy.
Or they might have a highly specific olfactory hallucination, like vividly smelling burnt toast or rotting garbage when absolutely nothing is there.
Or, in rare but documented cases, the aura can be something intensely philosophically profound.
Oh, like Dostoevsky.
Yes, exactly. The source text brings up the brilliant Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, who famously suffered from severe focal seizures. He described the auras that preceded his seizures as a feeling of such intense, overwhelming bliss and universal harmony that he once wrote, "For a few seconds of such bliss, I would give 10 or more years of my life. Even my whole life, perhaps."
It's an astonishing quote.
I want to pause on that because the implications are staggering. His physical brain, purely due to a localized pathological electrical misfire, a completely synthetic biological glitch, was generating the absolute maximum possible output of human euphoria and spiritual connection.
It is a stark, almost unsettling reminder that everything we feel, even our most transcendent life-defining emotions, are inexorably rooted in the mechanistic opening and closing of ion channels in neurobiology.
It's profound. What is clinically vital to understand here is that the aura is not a warning before the seizure. Biologically and electrophysiologically, the aura is the seizure.
Yes, it is the focal seizure in its infancy, subjectively experienced by the patient before it becomes objectively visible to the physician.
And from that initial aura, the progression of the electrical storm can be devastatingly rapid.
Right, the focal seizure can spread out from its origin, cross the corpus callosum, and recruit the entire brain. When this happens, the patient loses consciousness, falls to the ground, and enters the tonic phase.
In the tonic phase, massive, sustained muscle contraction occurs, causing all the extremities to rigidly extend.
Which is rapidly followed by the clonic phase, characterized by the violent, rhythmic, convulsive jerking of the muscles.
And when a seizure that started locally in a focus spreads to involve the whole brain in this manner, we call it a focal seizure with secondary generalization.
Exactly. And once that massive electrical storm finally burns itself out and terminates, the patient enters the post-ictal period, a time of profound neurological exhaustion, confusion, and gradual recovery.
So that entire progression, from a twitch to a localized aura to a full-body convulsion, is the focal side of the diagnostic tree. Let's pivot to the other main branch, generalized onset seizures.
These are completely different neurobiological beasts right from the very first millisecond.
Entirely different mechanisms are at play, right?
Entirely. Generalized onset seizures begin without any preceding aura or focal onset. The abnormal electrical activity involves and hijacks both cerebral hemispheres simultaneously, right from the very start.
So they are not spreading from a single cortical lesion.
No, instead they are driven by deep central circuits in the brain, often involving the dense reciprocal connections between the thalamus and the widespread cerebral cortex.
Because the thalamus acts as a central relay station, so if a hypersynchronous rhythm develops there, it can broadcast that pathological rhythm to the entire cortical surface in an instant.
Like flipping a master switch.
And even within the generalized category, where the whole brain is involved simultaneously, we see wildly different clinical presentations depending on exactly how those networks are hijacked.
Right, let's contrast two of the most distinct types, the typical absent seizure and the tonic-clonic seizure.
The typical absent seizure, which historically was called petit mal, predominantly affects children, doesn't it?
Yes, and it is incredibly deceptively subtle. It is so subtle that it is routinely missed by teachers, parents, and pediatricians for months, often misdiagnosed as attention deficit disorder or simple daydreaming.
How does it present?
A typical absent seizure begins abruptly, without warning. The child will suddenly cease all ongoing motor activity and simply stare blankly into space. They completely lose cognitive awareness of their surroundings.
But here is the critical neurobiological quirk. They do not lose postural tone, they do not fall over, they just look like they are locked in a deep, impenetrable trance.
Right. The entire event is incredibly brief, usually lasting less than 10 seconds. Then, just as abruptly as it began, they snap back to normal baseline consciousness.
So there is no aura before the event, and crucially, there is absolutely no post-ictal confusion afterward. They just pick up their sentence or their activity right where they left off, often entirely unaware that they lost 10 seconds of time.
Exactly.
Wait, if a generalized seizure involves the entire brain simultaneously, why don't they fall down? If the motor cortex is caught up in this electrical storm, shouldn't they convulse?
That is the fascinating part about the specific circuitry involved in an absent seizure. While the cortex is broadly swept up in this abnormal rhythm, the discharge does not recruit the descending motor pathways in the violent, sustained manner that a convulsion does, and it spares the deep brainstem structures that maintain basic postural muscle tone.
Oh, that makes sense.
If you were to record their brain waves during those 10 seconds of staring, you would see a very distinct, globally synchronized electrical signature, the classic 3 Hz spike and wave pattern on the EEG.
It is a highly synchronized rhythmic firing and inhibiting of the whole brain, oscillating 3 times a second, completely jamming their conscious processing for a few seconds, and then vanishing without a physical trace.
Contrast that gentle 10-second trance with the most common and dramatic motor type of generalized onset seizure, the tonic-clonic seizure, formerly known as grand mal.
This is the massive, violent convulsion that the general public immediately associates with the word epilepsy.
It begins abruptly, without an aura, and often initiates with a very distinct, terrifying grunt or cry.
Yes, and we must clarify the physiological mechanism behind that grunt because it is deeply distressing for bystanders and family members to witness. It sounds exactly like the person is in sudden agonizing pain.
But the patient is completely unconscious, right? They aren't screaming in pain.
Correct. They lose consciousness the millisecond the generalized storm hits. The sound is entirely mechanical.
When the generalized seizure strikes, it causes a massive, instantaneous, uncoordinated tonic contraction of almost all the skeletal muscles in the body. This includes the heavy muscles of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles of the thorax.
And this violent, sudden contraction acts exactly like a bellows, rapidly and forcefully pushing all the residual air out of the lungs, up the trachea, and forcing it through the tightly spasming vocal cords.
The grunt or cry is simply a forced mechanical expiration of air driven by a full-body muscle spasm.
It's pure physics acting on the anatomy of the airway. Following that initial cry, the patient enters the tonic phase. This lasts for about 30 seconds. They fall rigidly to the ground.
Their jaw clenches with immense force, which often leads to severe tongue biting. They frequently lose bowel or bladder control due to sphincter relaxation or abdominal muscle spasm.
And because their breathing muscles are locked in a rigid tetanic spasm, they cannot inhale oxygen. They quickly begin to turn blue, a dangerous state of hypoxia called cyanosis.
Then, as the inhibitory networks of the brain desperately try to fight back and break up the continuous electrical discharge, the seizure evolves into the clonic phase. The rigid tonicity breaks into rhythmic, violent, synchronous jerking of all 4 extremities and the head, which typically lasts for another 1 to 2 minutes.
And unlike the brief absent seizure that leaves the child perfectly fine 10 seconds later, a generalized tonic-clonic seizure exacts a massive, bruising physiological toll on the human body.
The postictal phase here is severe and prolonged. The patient will be deeply unarousable or intensely sleepy, heavily disoriented upon waking, and will uniformly complain of severe headache and profound whole-body muscle soreness due to the massive accumulation of lactic acid from the extreme muscle exertion.
So we have established the focal progression aura to secondary generalization and the primary generalized progression, which hits the whole brain at once. But if I'm an ER doctor and the paramedics wheel in a patient who is found on the sidewalk in the middle of a massive tonic-clonic convulsion, how on earth do I tell if they just suffered a primary generalized seizure or if they had a tiny focal seizure in their temporal lobe that just spread really, really fast?
That is one of the most persistent and critical challenges in clinical neurology. Because on purely observational clinical grounds, watching a patient in the throes of a full convulsion, a rapid secondary generalization is practically identical to a primary generalized seizure.
The endpoint is the exact same, right? Full body convulsions, locked muscles, and total loss of consciousness.
Exactly.
So how does a clinician figure it out? And more importantly, if the convulsion looks the same, why does distinguishing them matter so much?
It matters deeply because the underlying biology and therefore the pharmacological treatments are completely different. The specific anticonvulsant medications that work beautifully to stabilize the network in primary generalized seizures can actually exacerbate focal seizures, making them more frequent or more severe, and vice versa.
Wow, so you could make it worse if you guess wrong.
You absolutely could. Furthermore, identifying a seizure as focal implies a radically different etiology. A focal onset means there is a specific physical lesion somewhere in that patient's cortex. A small, slow-growing tumor, a focal cortical dysplasia they were born with, a scar from a forgotten head injury, or a vascular malformation.
Finding that specific focal lesion means the patient's epilepsy might actually be curable with a highly targeted neurosurgical resection.
Exactly. A primary generalized seizure, however, implies a global network instability or a widespread genetic ion channel mutation, which is generally treated with medication, not surgery.
So the only way the clinician can tell them apart is by being an absolute detective about the clinical history leading up to the exact moment of onset.
Yes. They have to rely on bystanders, or the patient's fleeting memory of the milliseconds before they blacked out.
Like, did the patient report a strange 2-second aura of tasting metal right before they lost consciousness?
Or did an observer notice that the patient's head and eyes forcefully deviated to the left for a moment before they fell? Did the violent jerking start specifically in the right leg before spreading to the arms?
That granular history is paramount to pinpointing the origin of the electrical storm.
And this intense clinical detective work categorizing the specific type of seizure has led to a broader evolution in how neurologists diagnose the overarching disease. We've moved beyond just classifying the isolated seizure event to classifying the epilepsies, the overarching clinical syndromes.
Because classifying the seizure is just describing the mechanical event of the electrical storm. Classifying the epilepsy syndrome involves analyzing the entire patient and their biological context.
We look at a multitude of variables. What is the age of onset? Does this specific seizure pattern only present in childhood and vanish by puberty? Is there a documented family history of inheritance?
What does their baseline neurological exam look like? And crucially, what does their baseline EEG look like between the massive seizures?
Using these variables, modern classification schemes categorize the epilepsies into two primary dimensions. First is the epilepsy localization related, meaning we strongly suspect a focal cortical abnormality, or is it generalized?
Okay, localization related versus generalized.
Second, is it symptomatic, meaning we can identify a clear structural or metabolic cause, like a massive stroke or severe head trauma? Or is it idiopathic, meaning the structural cause is completely unknown and is highly likely to be a genetic predisposition?
Well, the source material notes that the vast majority of adult-onset epilepsies are classified as symptomatic localization-related epilepsies, which makes intuitive biological sense.
It does.
As you move through decades of life, your brain accumulates physical insults. Small traumatic brain injuries, tiny microvascular strokes, severe central nervous system infections like encephalitis. These events leave localized, microscopic scars of gliosis in the cortex that slowly become hyperexcitable seizure foci over time.
That is correct. But it is important to acknowledge that we are still relying heavily on clinical phenotypes here, matching symptom patterns to broad categories.
Because the ultimate goal of modern neuroscience is that as our molecular and genetic understanding becomes infinitely more precise, we will transition to classifying these epilepsy syndromes by their true underlying biological and genetic etiologies.
Like the specific mutated sodium channel or the specific missing inhibitory neurotransmitter receptor, rather than just grouping them by how the convulsion looks on the outside.
But until we map every single gene and ion channel in a patient's brain, the immediate key to differentiating a primary generalized seizure from a rapidly generalizing focal seizure often lies hidden in the invisible resting electrical rhythm of the brain.
To see it, we have to look through the primary diagnostic window neurologists have used for nearly a century, the electroencephalogram.
The EEG. This brings us to the physics of the EEG and how it captures the activity of massive cortical ensembles. And we really need to take our time and rigorously break this down.
Definitely.
Because almost everyone has seen what an EEG looks like in a movie. You know, the messy, squiggly lines printing out on a screen. But very few people appreciate the massive, complex physics problems standing between a microscopic brain cell and that squiggly line.
It is a remarkable biophysical engineering problem. When neuroscientists study seizures or basic neurophysiology in a controlled laboratory setting, we use intracellular recordings.
So measuring from inside the cell.
Right, we can take a microscopic glass microelectrode, physically puncture the lipid membrane of a single living neuron in a petri dish, and measure the exact voltage difference across its membrane in millivolts. It is exquisitely precise and incredibly fast. We can easily visualize the sharp, towering spike of a single action potential, which is the fundamental unit of neuronal communication.
But an action potential is incredibly brief.
It is over in 1 to 2 milliseconds. It is a biological lightning strike.
And obviously you cannot drill a hole in a clinical patient's head and start poking single neurons with glass needles just to see if they have epilepsy.
No, you definitely cannot do that. In the clinical setting, we must rely on extracellular electrodes placed externally on the surface of the scalp. And these surface electrodes are absolutely blind to single-action potentials. They simply cannot sense them.
Why not? Is the electrical signal from one cell just too small to reach the scalp?
It is a compounding combination of physical resistance, distance, and time resolution. First, consider the time domain. As we said, an action potential is a blistering 1 to 2 millisecond event. The clinical EEG machine operates with a relatively slow time resolution, typically measuring fluctuations in the hundreds of milliseconds to seconds range.
So the ultra-fast spikes of single action potentials simply occur too quickly. They get filtered out by the recording mechanics.
Exactly. Therefore, what the EEG is primarily sensing and reflecting are the much slower, longer-lasting voltage changes occurring across the cell membranes. Specifically, it measures the synaptic potentials.
The tiny localized voltage shifts that occur when neurotransmitters bind to receptors on the dendrites, creating excitatory postsynaptic potentials, EPSPs, or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, IPSPs.
Yes. Because synaptic potentials last much longer, tens or hundreds of milliseconds, they have the time to physically overlap and summate with each other in the extracellular space.
But even if they summate, there is a massive physical barrier in the way. Between the microscopic brain cell generating the electricity and the metal electrode pasted onto the scalp, you have a deep layer of cerebral spinal fluid, 3 thick protective layers of the meninges, the dense porous bone of the human skull, and the thick skin and muscle of the scalp.
From a purely electrical engineering perspective, the brain tissue, the fluid, and especially the dense skull bone act as powerful resistors and capacitors in an electric circuit. They severely attenuate or muffle the electrical signal as it attempts to travel outward.
This distortion is massive. While a single neuron's internal voltage changes are measured in millivolts, thousandths of a volt, the electrical signal that finally penetrates through the skull and reaches the scalp electrode is measured in microvolts, millionths of a volt.
The signal is degraded by a factor of 1,000.
It reminds me of trying to record the audio of a massive football game, but instead of being inside, you are standing out in the parking lot outside the stadium holding a microphone in the air.
That's a great analogy.
An intracellular recording is like sending a reporter down to the front row with the boom mic, pointing it directly at the mouth of one specific fan. You hear every single word they say, every cheer, every groan, with perfect, isolated clarity. That is the action potential.
That perfectly illustrates the limitation of the surface EEG. The surface electrode is your microphone out in the parking lot. The massive, thick concrete walls of the stadium and the closed doors represent the skull and the meninges. They muffle the sound almost entirely.
You absolutely cannot hear the individual fan anymore. Their high-frequency individual shouts are completely filtered out by the concrete barriers.
What can you hear in the parking lot? You can only hear the deep, sustained, rumbling roar of an entire section of fans cheering together in synchronized unison for a prolonged period.
That deep, sustained roar that carries enough acoustic energy to penetrate the concrete walls is the biological equivalent of the summated synaptic potentials.
The EEG only hears the crowd when they sync up and sustain the noise. But there is another major limitation to the parking lot microphone, which is spatial bias.
Right. The microphone outside the stadium can really only hear the fans sitting in the upper decks, closest to the outer concrete wall. It cannot hear the people down in the luxury suites deep inside the center of the stadium, no matter how loud they cheer.
The clinical EEG suffers from the exact same severe spatial bias. It predominantly reflects the electrical activity of the cortical neurons in closest physical proximity to the scalp. The human cerebral cortex is highly convoluted. It is folded into deep valleys called sulci and outward ridges called gyri.
The scalp EEG can readily hear the activity at the crown of the gyri, right against the skull. But the deep structures, the hidden base of a cortical sulcus, the mesial walls where the two hemispheres face each other, and crucially deep structures like the hippocampus, the thalamus, or the brainstem, are almost completely invisible to the surface electrodes.
They are simply too far away, and the electrical signal attenuates aggressively over that distance.
So if the EEG is so heavily muffled by the skull acting as a giant resistor, and if it completely filters out the fast action potentials, and if it is blind to deep structures like the hippocampus, which we know is one of the most common places for severe focal seizures to start, Why on earth is it still the gold standard for diagnosing epilepsy? It sounds like an incredibly flawed tool.
It absolutely sounds like it shouldn't work, but this is precisely where the sheer pathological power of a seizure becomes undeniably apparent. The reason the EEG remains the gold standard is because of pathological
So
synchronicity.
pathological.
During a seizure, or even in the quiet periods between seizures, the neurons residing in the epileptic focus become abnormally intensely hypersynchronized.
Returning to the stadium, it is no longer just one section cheering for a play. It is 50,000 people screaming the exact same note at the exact same millisecond.
Yes, when thousands or millions of neurons fire their synaptic potentials in perfect pathological lockstep, the summated electrical current generated in the extracellular fluid becomes so massive that it punches right through the muffling effect of the skull and tissue.
It registers on the surface EEG as a massive, abrupt, high-voltage change from the normal background rhythm.
We define this as paroxysmal activity. On the classic EEG paper readout, these paroxysms appear as distinct sharp waves or towering spikes. Finding these interictal spikes, the abnormal synchronized bursts that happen between full-blown clinical seizures, is the primary detective method a neurologist uses to locate the hidden seizure focus in a resting patient.
And before we dive into the microscopic physics of what generates that spike, let's quickly establish what the normal, healthy background roar of the stadium looks like. When a neurologist reads a normal EEG, they analyze rhythms based on their frequency and amplitude.
We categorize the normal cortical rhythms by their frequency in hertz, which simply means cycles per second. The most famous is the alpha rhythm, which oscillates at 8 to 13 hertz.
These are moderate amplitude waves, typical of a state of relaxed wakefulness,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. They are most prominent over the parietal and occipital lobes at the back of the head.
Yeah.
If you are sitting quietly with your eyes closed, resting, your occipital cortex is generating beautiful, rhythmic alpha waves.
And then we have beta waves, which are faster, oscillating at 13 to 30 hertz, but they have a lower amplitude.
Beta activity is the signature of intense mental activity and active concentration. If you are deeply relaxed with your eyes closed generating alpha, and I suddenly command you to open your eyes and solve a complex calculus problem, your EEG instantly undergoes a process called desynchronization.
The slow, synchronized alpha waves vanish, rapidly replaced by the fast, busy, desynchronized beta activity, predominantly in the frontal areas of the brain.
The brain shifts from a synchronized idle state to an unsynchronized, highly active processing state. And then there are the much slower rhythms, delta, which is 0.5 to 4 hertz, and theta, which is 4 to 7 hertz.
Those slow waves are perfectly normal if you are falling asleep, right? Delta and theta are the hallmarks of drowsiness and the early stages of slow wave sleep.
But, and this is a critical diagnostic point, if a neurologist sees prominent, continuous delta or theta waves in fully awake, conscious adult, it is a massive red flag.
Because it is a non-specific sign of severe diffuse brain dysfunction.
Yes, it could indicate widespread structural damage, severe metabolic derangement, swelling, or the exhausted aftermath of a recent seizure.
So we know the EEG can read the normal background rhythms, and it can see the pathological paroxysmal spikes that punch through the skull during an epileptic event. But to truly comprehend what a spike on a digital screen actually represents in the physical, wet, biological tissue of the brain, we have to zoom all the way down to a single neuron and rigorously apply the fundamental laws of electrical physics.
This brings us to a complex biophysical concept we must explore: the polarity problem.
This is exactly where the biology of the brain and the physics of electromagnetism perfectly intersect. To understand how the EEG generates a signal, we first have to look at the unique architecture of the cerebral cortex and the main cellular actors involved, the pyramidal neurons.
Their geometry is everything. They are arranged in the 6 layers of the cerebral cortex, like millions of tall trees in a dense forest. Their cell bodies, the soma, sit relatively deep in the cortex, often in layer 3 or layer V.
From that deep cell body, they send a single, long, thick dendrite called the apical dendrite straight up toward the surface of the brain, perfectly perpendicular to the pia mater, which is the innermost layer of the meninges covering the brain.
This parallel, perpendicular orientation of millions of apical dendrites, all lined up next to each other pointing at the skull, provides the perfect anatomical scaffolding for generating summated electrical fields that can project outward to be read at the scalp.
Okay, let's visualize the physics of a single synaptic event on just one of these microscopic trees. Let's say an excitatory signal comes in from another part of the brain and synapses right at the very top of the apical dendrite in layer I, just barely under the surface of the brain. What is mechanically happening to the ions and the electricity at that exact spot?
When an excitatory postsynaptic potential, or EPSP, is generated at that superficial synapse on the apical dendrite, neurotransmitter channels open. Positively charged ionic current, predominantly sodium ions, rushes from the salty extracellular space, flows across the neuronal cell membrane, and enters the inside of the dendrite.
So positive charge is physically leaving the fluid outside the cell and moving into the interior of the cell.
Correct. From the perspective of the extracellular space, there is now a sudden, highly localized loss of positive charge right at that specific synaptic location. In electrophysiology, we call this area a current sink.
A current sink. Because positive charge has vanished from the extracellular fluid and gone inside, the extracellular fluid right around that specific synapse becomes relatively negative compared to the surrounding tissue.
Okay, we have created a negative sink at the top of the dendrite near the skull. But basic physics dictates that electricity needs a closed circuit. The current has to flow somewhere.
Exactly. The positive sodium current that entered the top of the dendrite flows down the inside of the dendritic shaft, moving toward the deep cell body. To complete the electrical loop, that intracellular current eventually has to leak back out of the cell, passively exiting across the membrane back into the extracellular space.
It usually does this much further down the cell, near the deep soma. Where that positive charge actively exits the cell, it creates what we call a current source. The extracellular fluid in this deep area now gains positive ions, becoming relatively positive.
So by initiating a single excitatory event at the top of the cell, we have physically created a dipole in the brain tissue. We have a negative pole, the sink at the top near the surface of the brain, and a positive pole, the source deeper down in the cortex.
Precisely. You have created a tiny biological battery, and the voltage signal this dipole creates in the extracellular space is entirely dictated by Ohm's law. Voltage equals current times resistance, or V equals IR.
The electrical resistance of the lipid neuronal membrane is vastly higher than the resistance of the salty extracellular fluid. This means that while the voltage change measured intracellularly across the highly resistant membrane is quite large, the voltage change measured extracellularly in the low-resistance fluid is incredibly small.
But if thousands of parallel pyramidal neurons all generate these tiny dipoles at the same exact time, they summate, creating a macroscopic electrical field that reaches the scalp.
Let's tie this back to the machine. If I place my metal EEG electrode on the surface of the patient's scalp directly above this activated dipole, what does the machine see? The electrode is on the scalp, which means it is physically closest to the top of the brain, so it is closest to the negative sink in layer 1.
Right. An extracellular electrode positioned near the current sink will detect a negative voltage deflection relative to a neutral reference electrode elsewhere on the body. Now, by convention in clinical EEG, and this often trips up medical students, a negative voltage is historically plotted as an upward deflection on the printed paper or screen.
Wait, so a negative voltage makes the line go up. That seems entirely counterintuitive.
It is a very stubborn historical quirk of clinical neurophysiology established decades ago. But yes, negative is uniformly plotted as an upward deflection.
Wow. Conversely, if you were to surgically place a microelectrode deep into the cortex near layer V, right next to the cell body and the current source, it would record a positive voltage in the extracellular fluid, resulting in a downward deflection on the recording.
The intracellular recording of that same cell, of course, just shows a massive positive depolarization regardless of where you measure it, because the inside of the cell became entirely positive.
This precise geometry brings us to the core of the polarity paradox, which proves how difficult it is to interpret an EEG. Because the brain is a highly complex, interconnected web, and inputs come from vastly different places. Let's walk through two different excitatory pathways into the cortex to show how the machine can be easily fooled.
The cerebral cortex has 6 distinct layers of cells, layer I being at the absolute surface, layers the 6 being the deepest layer bordering the white matter. Let's consider the first excitatory pathway. Afferent axons coming all the way up from the deep thalamus, the thalamocortical inputs.
These specific sensory axons predominantly terminate deep within the cortex, making synapses on the pyramidal dendrites in layer 4.
So the excitatory event, the EPFP, the influx of sodium, happens deep down in the cell. Positive ions rush into the cell in layer 4.
Correct. That influx creates a current sink, a zone of extracellular negativity, deep down in layer 4. The electrical current then flows up the inside of the apical dendrite and passively exits near the top of the cell, creating a current source, a zone of extracellular positivity superficially in layer 1 or 2.
Therefore, for a thalamocortical input, the surface of the brain becomes relatively positive. And because the surface EEG electrode is sitting right next to this superficial positive source, it records a positive voltage. On the machine, that plots as a downward deflection.
Exactly. Deep synapse equals downward deflection. Now, let's look at a second, completely different pathway. Excitatory axons coming from the contralateral hemisphere, the other side of the brain, crossing over via the corpus callosum.
These associative axons terminate predominantly on the distal superficial parts of the apical dendrites in layers 2 and 3.
So this time, the exact same biological event, the EPSP, happens near the surface of the brain. Positive ions rush in up top. This creates a current sink, a zone of extracellular negativity near the surface.
And the current flows down inside the cell and exits deep near the cell body, creating a positive source deep down.
Yes, and because the surface EEG electrode is now sitting right next to the superficial negative sink, it records a negative voltage. On the machine, this plots as an upward deflection.
We need to pause and realize how wild this is. An excitatory input from the contralateral hemisphere causes an upward line on the screen. An excitatory input from the thalamus causes a downward line on the screen.
The biological event, an excitatory postsynaptic potential, is identically excitatory in both scenarios. The target pyramidal neuron is depolarizing and moving closer to firing an action potential in both cases. But the squiggly line on the diagnostic machine goes in perfectly opposite directions simply because of where the synapse happen to land on the vertical geometry of the cell.
The recording machine is entirely agnostic to the complex biology. It only rigidly obeys the physics of the dipole. And the paradox gets even more complex when you introduce inhibition. An excitatory EPSP occurring in the superficial layers creates a surface negativity, an upward line. But an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, an IPSP, occurring in the deeper layers, where negative chloride ions rush into the cell, creating a deep positive sink and a superficial negative source, also creates a surface negativity.
So a massive excitatory event looks identically the same on an EEG tracing as a massive inhibitory event, entirely depending on where it hits the dendritic tree. How does a clinical neurologist ever figure out what is actually happening in a patient's brain during a seizure if the raw data is this deeply ambiguous?
That ambiguity highlights the absolute limitations of relying on raw single-channel data. You cannot unambiguously determine the biological polarity, whether it is excitatory or inhibitory, or the deep anatomical origin of cortical synaptic events from a single surface EEG channel.
This is exactly why neurologists never use just one electrode. They use dense arrays of electrodes, complex spatial montages, covering the entire geometry of the head.
They are not just looking for a line going up or down. They are looking at phase reversals between adjacent electrodes to triangulate the exact three-dimensional center of the electrical field. They also rely heavily on the patient's clinical context, whether the patient is awake or in a specific stage of sleep, and an advanced understanding of the dominant pacing mechanisms of the brain, like those thalamocortical loops, to meticulously decode this complex matrix of sinks and sources.
The relevance to you, the listener, navigating this advanced material, is that understanding the EEG is a masterclass in critical scientific thinking. It proves unequivocally that raw data is completely meaningless without a deep mechanical understanding of the physical and biological systems generating that data.
You cannot just memorize a textbook rule that an upward line means the brain is excited. You have to deeply understand the formation of the dipole, the electrical resistance of the tissues, the precise vertical anatomy of the pyramidal cell, and the specific cortical layer of the synapsing axons.
The unseen structural context dictates the reality of the visible data.
It is the ultimate synthesis of neuroanatomy, cellular physiology, and electromagnetism. And despite its intense physical limitations, it remains the only non-invasive way we can peer through the dense bone of the skull and watch the chaotic, hypersecretous electrical storms of epilepsy unfold in real time.
What an immense multidisciplinary journey we've taken in this deep dive. We started in the battlefields of 400 BC with the ancient Greeks noticing that contralateral head injuries cause localized shaking.
We moved to Victorian London with John Hewlings Jackson watching a focal seizure meticulously march across the motor homunculus, mapping the brain without ever opening the skull.
We dissected exactly what a seizure is clinically, contrasting the subtle, posture-maintaining trance of an absent seizure with the massive lactic acid-producing physiological bellows of a tonic-clonic grunt.
And we ended by zooming all the way down to the microscopic biophysics of current sinks and sources in the dendritic trees of pyramidal neurons, tracking how their tiny microvolt signals filter through the dense electrical resistance of the human skull to form a diagnostic tracing.
We have established the clinical language, the observational classification, and the rigorous physical tools of measurement. But this entire exploration is just the mechanical foundation.
Because in part 2 of our Enkephalikos deep dive on seizures, we are going to look at what actually causes that localized electrical storm to ignite in the first place.
We're going to explore the precise cellular mechanisms of how a tiny seizure focus manages to break down its inhibitory surround, the chemical guards keeping it in check, and manages to spread out and hijack the entire neural network of the brain.
It is a microscopic story of rogue, mutated ion channels, massive neurotransmitter imbalances, and the catastrophic collapse of the brain's internal network failsafes.
Until then, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. We spend our whole lives inside our heads, assuming our thoughts, our cherished memories, and our very sense of self are just abstract, ethereal concepts floating in the ether of the mind.
But as the sheer biophysics of the EEG undeniably proves, your consciousness, your awareness, your very existence are quite literally generating distinct, physically measurable electromagnetic dipole fields across your cortex every single second of your life.
Even right now, at this exact moment, as your brain comprehends these very words I am speaking, millions of alpha and beta waves are sweeping across the pyramidal neurons in your auditory and frontal cortices, creating millions of tiny current sinks and sources beneath your skull.
The brain is, at its core, a highly advanced electrical machine.
And if the violent seizures we discussed today map the brain through explosive, visible electrical storms, well, what other invisible, subtle, highly organized electrical storms might be shaping human behavior, defining our mood and dictating our personalities without us even realizing it?
A truly powerful question to consider.
Thank you for joining us on this masterclass. We will see you in the next session of the Enkephalikos series as we continue to learn about the brain, not just stroke by stroke, but spark by spark.